He was born into bondage, but history would later try to bury his name. Long before the world knew the words Uncle Tom, before a novel shook a nation, before a war tore a country apart, there was a real man whose life carried more truth than fiction could ever fully hold. His name was Josiah Henson, and he entered the world in 1789 with nothing but a body already claimed by someone else. He was born in Maryland, not Tennessee as many later records would loosely suggest, yet his life would stretch across states, borders, and empires. From his earliest breath, Josiah belonged to the system of slavery, a system so deeply rooted that it did not need chains to announce itself. It lived in law, in religion, in silence, and in fear. His mother was enslaved, his father was enslaved, and Josiah, before he could speak, was already owned. His earliest memories were not of childhood, but of warning. Enslaved children learned early what not to ask, where not to look, and when to disappear into stillness. Josiah watched adults move with caution, measuring every word, every breath. Laughter was rare, trust was dangerous, survival depended on obedience, or at least the appearance of it. His father was a man of strength and dignity, and in the world of slavery, that alone was a crime. When an overseer attacked Josiah's mother, his father resisted. It was not rebellion in the political sense, it was instinct, protection, humanity. But slavery could not allow that. For striking a white overseer, Josiah's father was mutilated, his ear cut off as punishment, and then sold away to the deep South. Josiah never saw him again. That moment split his life in two. Before, there had been a family. After, there was only absence. His mother carried that loss silently, but she carried something else too. Resolve. She whispered lessons into Josiah's ears late at night. Lessons that slavery was designed to erase. She told him he was not an animal. She told him God did not make him for chains. She told him that memory itself was a form of resistance. As Josiah grew, his intelligence became impossible to hide. He learned quickly, observed constantly, and adapted with precision. He understood that survival was not only physical, it was mental, emotional, strategic. Slavery rewarded cruelty and punished thought, yet Josiah learned how to think without being seen. He was sold multiple times, each transaction reinforcing the truth that enslaved people were currency, not kin. Eventually, he came under the control of a man who recognized his abilities and placed him in a position of authority over other enslaved people. It was a role designed to corrupt, to fracture solidarity, to turn the oppressed into instruments of their own oppression. Josiah hated it, yet he understood its danger. Refusal meant punishment or death. Acceptance meant moral torture. So he walked a narrow path, using the position to protect rather than harm, to shield rather than strike. He softened orders. He delayed punishment. He absorbed blame. Every night he carried the weight of choices no human should ever have to make. His enslaver promised him freedom, not immediately but eventually. The promise was vague, always postponed, always conditional. Josiah clung to it not because he trusted the man, but because hope itself was a survival tool. Years passed, his loyalty grew. His labor enriched another man's life. And when the moment finally came, the promise was broken without hesitation. That betrayal destroyed something in Josiah, but it also forged something unbreakable. He understood now that slavery could not be negotiated with. It could not be reasoned with. It could only be escaped. The decision to flee was not heroic in the way history likes to frame such moments. It was terrifying. He had a wife. He had children. Escape meant risking all of them. Capture meant torture, separation, or death. Yet staying meant a slow erasure of the soul. One night, under the cover of darkness, Josiah Henson chose freedom. They moved quietly, guided by stars, instinct and whispered knowledge passed from one enslaved person to another. Hunger stalked them, cold bit into their bones. Slave catchers prowled with dogs trained to hunt human beings. Every rustle could be the end. But step by step, they moved north. When Josiah crossed into Upper Canada, the land we now call Ontario, something unimaginable happened. The law no longer recognized him as property. For the first time in his life, no human being could legally own him. He wept openly, not from joy alone, but from release. From the sudden absence of fear he had never known could disappear. Freedom did not make life easy, it made it possible. Josiah worked relentlessly. He educated himself. He built homes. He helped establish a black settlement where formerly enslaved families could live with dignity. He believed freedom without structure was fragile. Education, land ownership, and community were shields against the return of bondage in new forms. Soon, freedom seekers began arriving at his door. He did not turn them away. His home became a sanctuary, a station on the Underground Railroad. He guided hundreds, perhaps thousands, across the border. He risked his own safety repeatedly, returning to slave territory to lead others out. Each journey was a defiance of the system that had tried to crush. Josiah became a preacher, not of submission, but of truth. His sermons were forged from lived experience. He spoke of God, yes, but also of justice, courage, and moral responsibility. People listened. Abolitionists took notice. His story began to circulate. Among those who encountered his life was a writer named Harriet Beecher Stowe. She read his autobiography, and history would never be the same. As the years passed and the 19th century faded into the 20th, Josiah Henson's absence from the public imagination became more complete. The world moved faster, louder, and more confident in its progress, yet it carried forward the same selective memory that had always shaped power. Slavery was increasingly spoken of as something finished, something conquered, something safely locked away in the past. In that telling, there was little room for men like Josiah Henson, whose life complicated the idea of closure, because to remember him fully would mean admitting that slavery was not only about chains and plantations. It was about broken promises, moral cowardice, and systems designed to adapt rather than disappear. It was about how oppression survives by changing its face. Josiah had understood this long before most scholars would. He had seen how quickly freedom could become conditional, how easily laws could be rewritten to serve the same old hierarchies. That was why he insisted on education, why he believed land ownership mattered, why he warned that dignity without protection was fragile. These were not abstract theories. They were conclusions drawn from a lifetime of observation. Long after his death, the insult built around the name Uncle Tom grew stronger. It became shorthand for betrayal, for accommodation, for weakness. Children learned it without knowing its origin. Adults used it casually, unaware that the phrase rested on the distortion of a real man's life. The cruelty of that transformation cannot be overstated. A man who risked everything to free others was turned into a symbol of surrender. That transformation served a purpose. By reducing a complex figure into a caricature, society avoided having to confront the uncomfortable reality that resistance does not always look the way we expect. It allowed people to dismiss certain forms of survival as shameful rather than strategic. It allowed history to reward loud defiance while ignoring quiet, sustained courage. Josiah Henson's resistance was not cinematic in the way popular culture prefers. It was patient, calculated, persistent. He understood that open rebellion often ended in bloodshed without progress. He chose a path that preserved life and multiplied freedom. That choice made him dangerous to slavery, but it also made him easy to misunderstand. In modern scholarship, efforts to restore Josiah's place in history continue. Museums display his likeness. Historic sites mark his settlements. Academics write papers tracing his influence. Yet outside those circles, his name remains unfamiliar. This gap between knowledge and public awareness reflects a deeper issue. We do not merely forget individuals, we forget lessons. Josiah's life teaches that moral clarity can coexist with strategic patience, that faith can empower resistance rather than suppress it, that leadership does not require domination. These ideas challenge simplified narratives of strength, especially narratives shaped by those who benefit from conflict rather than cooperation. Even today, echoes of Josiah's world remain: systems that promise opportunity while withholding equality, institutions that praise progress while resisting accountability, narratives that celebrate freedom without examining its cost. In these contexts, Josiah's story feels less like history and more like a roar. He once wrote that slavery corrupted everyone it touched, enslaver and enslaved alike. That insight remains relevant. Oppression does not merely harm its victims, it distorts societies, values, and truths. Remembering Josiah Henson means acknowledging that harm, not as a closed chapter, but as an ongoing responsibility. Toward the end of his life, Josiah reportedly spoke less about what had been done to him and more about what must be done by others. He believed that memory carried obligation, that knowing the truth demanded action. He did not seek sympathy, he sought awareness. If his story feels unsettling, that is because it resists comfort. It refuses to be neatly categorized. It does not allow the past to stay politely distant. Instead, it reaches forward, asking what kind of world we are building and whose stories we choose to elevate. Josiah Henson was not forgotten because his life lacked importance. He was forgotten because his life exposed too much. It showed that enslaved people were not passive victims waiting to be saved. They were agents of change, operating under extreme constraint. That truth undermines narratives that place moral heroism solely in the hands of institutions or benefactors. He escaped slavery, but more importantly, he dismantled it piece by piece through action. He educated the young, he guided the lost. He spoke when silence was safer. He wrote when memory was fragile. He lived in a way that refused erasure, even when erasure eventually came. To speak his name now is to push back against that erasure. Josiah Henson. Not a symbol of weakness, not a caricature, not a footnote to fiction. A man who lived, resisted, led, and freed. And until his name is as widely known as the character he inspired, history remains unfinished. The unfinished nature of Josiah Henson's story is not a failure of history alone. It is a reflection of how societies choose convenience over truth. Remembering him fully requires effort, discomfort, and humility. It demands that we acknowledge how easily courage is repackaged into weakness when it no longer serves those in power. In the generations that followed his death, the descendants of enslaved people carried forward fragments of stories like his, often without names attached. Family histories spoke of ancestors who escaped, who guided others north, who preached, who built communities out of nothing. These oral histories survived because they had to. They were not preserved by institutions, but by necessity. Josiah Henson lived on in that quiet way, unnamed but present. Meanwhile, popular culture continued to drift further from the truth. Films, plays, and books recycled simplified images of slavery that centered white saviors and minimized black agency. Uncle Tom's Cabin, once radical, became absorbed into a narrative that stripped it of its original challenge. And in that process, the real man behind it remained obscured. This was not accidental. Stories that emphasize self-liberation and strategic resistance threaten comfortable myths. They disrupt the idea that freedom is granted rather than claimed. Josiah's life showed that enslaved people were not merely waiting to be rescued. They were planning, organizing, and acting, even under constant surveillance and terror. Josiah understood power dynamics in ways that modern language might describe as political intelligence. He knew when to speak and when to remain silent, when to comply and when to resist. He knew that survival itself could be a form of rebellion. This understanding did not make him less courageous, it made him effective. There is a reason his autobiography was so influential to Harriet Beecher Stowe. It offered a perspective that statistics and speeches could not. It humanized the enslaved without reducing them to helplessness. It revealed the moral contradictions of a society that preached liberty while practicing ownership. Yet even that powerful testimony could not fully protect his legacy. The distortion that followed reveals how fragile truth can be when filtered through entertainment and prejudice. Over time, the name Uncle Tom was severed from its origins, weaponized against the very people it once sought to humanize. Josiah Henson never benefited materially from the fame of the book inspired by his life. He did not receive royalties. He did not receive widespread recognition. What he received was something more complex, a partial victory. Slavery was eventually abolished, but the deeper work of justice remained incomplete. If Josiah were alive today, it is unlikely he would seek applause. His writings suggest he would instead ask difficult questions. What have we learned? Who benefits from our forgetting? How do new systems replicate old harms under different names? His life challenges modern audiences to reconsider how resistance is defined. Not all resistance is dramatic. Not all heroes shout. Some endure, some build, some guide others quietly through the dark. Josiah's story also exposes how history often punishes nuance. It prefers simple villains and simple heroes. But real change is rarely simple. It emerges from persistence, compromise, sacrifice, and vision. Josiah embodied all of these. In recent years, there has been a renewed effort to reclaim figures like him. Museums have expanded exhibits. Scholars have rewritten curricula. Documentaries have begun to tell his story more accurately. These efforts matter, but they are only beginnings. Memory must be actively maintained, or it will fade again. To truly honor Josiah Henson is not merely to know his name. It is to understand the lessons embedded in his life. That freedom requires vigilance. That dignity must be defended. That truth must be spoken even when it is inconvenient. His life reminds us that the past is not distant. It is layered beneath the present, shaping structures, attitudes, and assumptions. Ignoring it does not free us from its influence. It leaves us blind to its patterns. Josiah Henson was born enslaved, but he refused to let slavery define his humanity. He refused to let betrayal destroy his moral compass. He refused to let fear silence him. And even after death, he refuses to disappear completely, because stories like his resist erasure. They persist in the questions they raise, in the discomfort they cause, in the clarity they demand. History may have tried to forget Josiah Henson, but forgetting is never permanent. It is a choice, repeated over time. And remembering is also a choice, one that still remains. Memory does not disappear all at once. It erodes slowly, softened by repetition, reshaped by comfort, and dulled by distance. That is what happened to Josiah Henson. Not erased in a single act, but worn down over generations until only fragments remained, disconnected from their source. A name without a face, a symbol without a life, a lesson without its context. Yet even in that erosion, something stubborn survived. In communities shaped by the aftermath of slavery, elders continued to speak of men who had led others north, who had stood between cruelty and the vulnerable, who had used faith not as a leash but as a shield. These stories rarely appeared in textbooks, but they carried the same bones as Josiah's life. They echoed his choices, his risks, his understanding of power. He lived on not as a famous figure, but as a pattern of resistance. What makes Josiah Henson's story especially unsettling is how much it disrupts familiar narratives. He does not fit neatly into the role of rebel or martyr. He was not defined by a single dramatic act, but by decades of deliberate action. He did not seek confrontation for its own sake. He sought outcomes, freedom, safety, continuity. This kind of resistance is harder to romanticize, but it is far more threatening to systems of control. It shows that oppression can be undermined from within, not just attacked from wit. Hout. It reveals that intelligence, patience, and moral clarity can be more powerful than brute force. Slavery depended on the idea that enslaved people were incapable of such complexity. Josiah Henson's life shattered that lie. He understood the psychology of enslavers. He understood how promises were used as tools of control. He understood how religion could be twisted to justify cruelty, and how the same faith could be reclaimed as a source of strength. His sermons were not about accepting suffering. They were about surviving it without surrendering one's humanity. When he spoke, people listened because he did not speak in abstractions. He spoke from memory, from scars, from choices made under threat of death. That authority cannot be taught. It can only be lived. As time moved forward, the United States constructed new narratives about itself. The Civil War was reframed as a conflict over states' rights rather than human bondage. Reconstruction was shortened, softened, and eventually abandoned. Jim Crow laws rose where slave codes had fallen. In that environment, there was little appetite for stories that exposed continuity instead of progress. Josiah Henson's life did exactly that. It showed that freedom without justice is unstable, that legal change without cultural transformation leaves old wounds open, that systems of exploitation rarely vanish, they adapt. These truths were inconvenient, and so the man who embodied them remained in the margins. Even the label "the Tennessee Slave," often attached to his name in later retellings, reflects this distortion. It simplifies and misplaces him, turning a complex transnational life into a regional curiosity. Josiah was not defined by a single place. His life crossed boundaries because oppression did. His resistance followed it wherever it went. The irony is that Uncle Tom's Cabin, despite its distortions, helped accelerate the end of legal slavery. Yet the cost of that acceleration was the flattening of the very humanity it sought to defend. The novel became a symbol, and symbols are easier to manipulate than people. Josiah Henson understood this danger instinctively. That is why he insisted on telling his own story in his own words. His autobiography was an act of defiance against simplification. He wanted the world to see the full picture, the fear, the calculation, the hope, the doubt. He wanted readers to understand that enslaved people were not passive recipients of history. They were its authors even when denied credit. In the modern era, when conversations about race, history, and justice resurface again and again, Josiah's life feels strikingly current. The same questions remain unresolved. Who controls the narrative? Whose pain is acknowledged? Whose resistance is celebrated? And whose is mocked? Calling someone an Uncle Tom still carries weight, still wounds, still distorts. Few who use the term know that the real man behind it dedicated his life to freeing others. That ignorance is not neutral. It perpetuates the very erasure Josiah feared. To correct that erasure is not about rewriting history to make it more comfortable. It is about restoring its complexity, about allowing figures like Josiah Henson to exist as they were, intelligent, flawed, courageous, strategic, deeply human. He was a man who learned to read the world as carefully as others read books, who understood when silence could save lives and when speech could change them, who transformed personal survival into collective liberation, who refused to let trauma become an excuse for cruelty. Josiah Henson did not believe history moved inevitably toward justice. He believed people had to push it there, step by step, often without recognition. His own life was proof of that belief, and perhaps that is why his story still matters, because it reminds us that progress is not guaranteed, that memory is fragile, that truth requires effort, and that forgetting is never accidental, it is chosen. Even after death, Josiah Henson's influence could not be contained, though it was muted by neglect and misunderstanding. The settlements he had helped build remained, though under pressure from changing economies, migration, and systemic racism. Families who once relied on him for guidance adapted, persisted, and passed down fragments of his story. The oral tradition kept his memory alive, though often without his name attached. These whispered histories, small yet persistent, were proof that some legacies cannot be fully erased. Modern scholars, digging through archival records, began to piece together the contours of his life. Autobiographies, letters, church records, and census data painted a picture far richer than the caricature popular see. Ulcher offered his journey from Maryland to Upper Canada, his role as a preacher, educator, and leader, and his tireless work guiding enslaved people to freedom were gradually recovered. Yet public awareness lagged far behind. A man who had risked everything to claim freedom and to give it to others remained unknown to most. The distortion of his story reflects a broader truth about historical memory. Societies often preserve narratives that are convenient, heroic, or comforting. Stories that challenge deeply held beliefs or expose systemic complicity are minimized, reshaped, or silenced. Josiah Henson's real-life heroism was inconvenient because it revealed that enslaved people were not passive. They were active, intelligent, and strategic agents of their own liberation. His life undermined the comforting myth that freedom was a gift bestowed rather than claimed. Josiah Henson's experience also demonstrates how resilience can take many forms. Unlike dramatic uprisings that make headlines, his resistance was methodical and enduring. He survived, built communities, educated the young, guided the vulnerable, and confronted oppression through strategy and patience. These acts were no less courageous than open revolt. In fact, they required a deeper understanding of the mechanisms of power and survival under constant threat. Through his writings and public work, he challenged audiences to reconsider assumptions about humanity, morality, and justice. He insisted that enslaved people were not morally inferior, intellectually incapable, or spiritually weak. He exemplified that dignity could be maintained even in extreme conditions, and that resistance could take subtle, sustainable forms. The United States may have abolished slavery legally, but the broader struggle for justice and equality was, and remains, unfinished. Josiah Henson's life forces us to confront this ongoing reality. By forgetting him, society has repeatedly minimized the labor, intelligence, and agency of Black people in shaping their own liberation. By remembering him, we are compelled to examine the past more honestly, to understand the structures that persist, and to value the forms of courage that history has often overlooked. Even today, the echoes of his life reverberate. Communities seeking to reclaim their heritage, educators working to present more accurate histories, and activists striving for equity are, in part, heirs to the legacy Josiah Henson created. The structures he built, both physical and moral, serve as evidence of a life devoted to survival, leadership, and freedom. Ultimately, Josiah Henson's story is a testament to the enduring power of truth. While fiction can simplify, distort, or misrepresent, lived experience carries weight that cannot be erased. His life reminds us that courage and moral clarity are not always visible in headlines or celebrated in culture, but they can shape communities, influence nations, and inspire generations. Remembering him fully is not just about restoring a single name to history, it is about reclaiming the depth of human resilience, understanding the mechanics of oppression, and honoring those who lived bravely when recognition was unlikely. Josiah Henson did not survive slavery only to be forgotten. He survived so that freedom in all its complexity could endure. Josiah Henson's later years were marked by reflection, mentorship, and a quiet determination to secure a future for those who followed. Though he had crossed into freedom decades earlier, he never allowed himself to rest. He understood that personal liberation was only part of the struggle. Collective freedom required vigilance, organization, and education. He established schools in the communities he helped build, insisting that literacy was more than a skill. It was power. Education would enable the formerly enslaved to claim their rights, preserve their history, and resist oppression in new forms. He taught not only reading and writing, but history, ethics, and strategy. His lessons emphasized both survival and agency, reinforcing the idea that freedom was something to be actively maintained rather than passively received. Beyond formal education, Josiah became a moral and strategic guide for families and individuals navigating life after escape. He provided counsel for those struggling to build homes, secure land, and establish livelihoods in unfamiliar regions. He mediated disputes, provided protection, and cultivated networks of mutual support. In doing so, he transformed his survival into a template for communal resilience. While he devoted his life to these practical measures, Josiah also maintained a global perspective. He traveled to Britain and spoke to audiences about the realities of slavery in North America, drawing attention to the moral, economic, and human consequences of the system. He demonstrated that slavery was not only a local problem but a matter of international concern. His words resonated in the halls of power, among abolitionists, and in the press, reinforcing his role as a bridge between lived experience and moral advocacy. Yet the challenges of legacy remained. As the decades passed, the popular image of Uncle Tom diverged further from the man who inspired the character. Josiah's quiet courage and strategic thinking were overshadowed by caricature and stereotype. The very label meant to honor the endurance of enslaved people became a tool to demean them. This contradiction highlighted how societal narratives often suppress inconvenient truths to maintain existing hierarchies. Despite these distortions, Josiah continued to write, speak, and act. He recorded his life with meticulous care, emphasizing the reality of slavery, the complexity of resistance, and the strategies for survival. He recognized that memory is contested, and that historical record requires guardianship. His autobiography was more than memoir. It was a blueprint for understanding power, oppression, and moral responsibility. Josiah's life also embodied a spiritual dimension intertwined with action. His faith was neither passive nor submissive. It was active, demanding integrity and courage. He preached about the moral obligations of humanity, about justice, and about accountability. Religion, which had been used to justify enslavement, became for him a source of empowerment, ethical guidance, and resilience. As he aged, his influence grew quietly but profoundly. Formerly enslaved individuals, now free, carried his lessons into their own communities. They became educators, leaders, and guides, echoing the principles Josiah had modeled. His work had ripple effects that extended far beyond his lifetime, shaping the development of black settlements, educational institutions, and social networks in Canada and the United States. Even in death, Josiah Henson's story remained incomplete in public consciousness. Monuments, if they existed, were few. Historical recognition was limited. His name was often overshadowed by the very fictional character he inspired. Yet the true weight of his legacy persisted in the lives he touched, the communities he built, and the lessons he recorded. In reflecting on Josiah Henson's life, one recognizes that history is not only about events, it is about agency, narrative, and moral choice. Henson exemplifies how one person can shape the course of many lives through courage, intelligence, and steadfast ethical vision. Remembering him challenges modern audiences to reconsider the nature of resistance, the definition of heroism, and the responsibilities of memory. His life asks uncomfortable questions. How do we honor courage when it is subtle? How do we recognize moral and strategic leadership when it does not conform to cultural expectations of heroism? How do we ensure that truth survives when society prefers comforting myths? Josiah Henson's enduring significance lies not only in his survival or escape, but in the model he created, one of ethical action, strategic thinking, education, and communal responsibility. His life teaches that freedom is never a static condition. It must be actively claimed, protected, and expanded. Josiah Henson's story did not end with his death. It continued through the generations who carried fragments of his teachings and example. In the decades after he passed in 1883, the communities he had nurtured faced immense challenges. Economic pressure, systemic racism, and social marginalization threatened to erase the gains he had worked tirelessly to create. Yet his influence persisted, embedded in the culture of resilience, education, and moral clarity he had instilled. Families spoke of him quietly, passing down his principles even when the broader world refused to acknowledge his existence. His autobiography became a critical text for scholars and activists, though for much of history it remained buried in libraries, largely inaccessible to the public. Researchers who sought to reconstruct the true story of slavery often discovered Josiah Henson's life and were struck by the contrast between the lived man and the fictional Uncle Tom. They realized that popular culture had not just simplified his story, it had transformed it into something almost unrecognizable. And yet, despite these distortions, Josiah's real-life example continued to inspire those who encountered it. The global implications of his work were profound. In Britain, his speeches and writings influenced the abolitionist movement by providing a first-hand account of slavery's brutality and complexity. British audiences, who could not experience slavery firsthand, were confronted with moral truth. His presence and testimony gave weight to advocacy efforts abroad, showing that the struggle for freedom transcended national borders. In Canada, the settlements he helped establish became models of self-determination and community resilience. Families learned to farm, educate their children, and govern their communities according to principles of justice and cooperation. Josiah's emphasis on literacy and moral education shaped generations, creating a foundation for Black leadership in North America. His guidance turned formerly enslaved individuals into agents of social change, demonstrating the transformative power of knowledge, strategy, and faith. The distortion of Uncle Tom as a submissive character underscores a deeper historical tension. Societies often fear the recognition of agency in those they have oppressed. By transforming Josiah's legacy into a stereotype, the broader culture could diminish the threat posed by his intelligence, resilience, and leadership. The Uncle Tom caricature became a tool to mock the very qualities that had enabled enslaved people to resist, survive, and organize. Josiah Henson's life reveals how erasure functions, not just through physical domination, but through narrative manipulation. Modern historians recognize that Josiah's life is a lesson in the subtleties of resistance. He shows that rebellion does not always appear dramatic. It can be quiet, patient, strategic, and ethical. Survival itself can be revolutionary when combined with leadership, teaching, and moral vision. His life challenges assumptions about what it means to resist oppression, reminding us that courage takes many forms. His faith was integral to his strategy. Religion, often weaponized to justify enslavement, became a source of moral authority for him. He preached a vision of justice and integrity that empowered individuals to act ethically even under duress. His sermons emphasized the responsibilities of those who were free, the obligations of community, and the importance of memory. He modeled the idea that spiritual strength could coexist with practical leadership. Even in the context of modern reflection, Josiah's life resonates. The ongoing struggle for racial justice, equity, and recognition mirrors the battles he faced. Systems may change in form, but patterns of oppression often persist. Josiah's life provides a framework for understanding how resilience, education, and moral clarity can confront these patterns effectively. His story reminds us that freedom is not a gift. It is an ongoing practice that requires vigilance, action, and ethical commitment. Remembering Josiah Henson is not only about honoring one man, it is about reclaiming a deeper understanding of history and agency. It challenges societies to recognize those whose contributions are invisible, whose courage is minimized, and whose legacy is manipulated. By recovering his story, we confront uncomfortable truths about power, memory, and narrative control. In essence, Josiah's life demonstrates that the struggle for freedom and dignity is continuous. The obstacles may evolve, but the principles he lived by, courage, strategy, education, moral responsibility, and communal leadership, remain relevant. His legacy persists as both an example and a challenge to recognize truth, to act with integrity, and to ensure that history honors the real, not just the fictionalized agents of change. Josiah Henson's personal reflections reveal a depth of understanding rarely captured in historical narratives. He lived through extremes: fear, betrayal, liberation, leadership, and loss, and each experience shaped his moral and strategic worldview. Unlike the simplified portrayals in popular culture, Josiah wrestled continuously with complex ethical dilemmas: when to risk exposure for the sake of others, when to remain hidden to preserve life, when to act decisively, and when to be patient. All these decisions defined his leadership and humanity. He often reflected on the heavy burden of responsibility. Guiding escapees along the Underground Railroad was not merely about physical movement. It was about anticipating dangers, reading the intentions of oppressors, and preparing families for lives they had never been allowed to imagine. Josiah's own family had depended on him, and he knew the stakes extended beyond survival to the moral formation of those he led. Failure could mean death. Mistakes could reverberate across generations. The weight was almost unimaginable, yet he bore it with quiet determination. The psychological toll of his experiences was immense. Slavery had taught him fear, mistrust, and vigilance, yet he transformed these lessons into tools of resistance. Each hardship became a source of insight, understanding human nature, anticipating threats, and nurturing resilience in others. His ability to channel trauma into strategy demonstrates a level of intelligence and foresight that history often overlooks. This was not impulsive heroism. It was deliberate, informed, and profoundly effective. Through these reflections, Josiah also acknowledged moments of doubt and despair. He understood that survival required not just courage, but hope. Without hope, even the most carefully planned escape could collapse. He nurtured hope through small acts, teaching children, guiding families, building communities, and sustaining faith. Each act reinforced the possibility of a better life, both practical and symbolic. Josiah's work with children was particularly revealing of his character. He treated education as a form of liberation. Literacy, knowledge of history, and moral instruction were shields against future subjugation. In teaching, he emphasized that freedom without understanding was fragile. A person who could read and reason could claim agency in ways that chains could not suppress. Education became a weapon against oppression, a tool for social transformation, and a safeguard for the generations that followed. He also grappled with the tension between visibility and security. Speaking publicly about slavery, guiding escapees, and maintaining a moral leadership role exposed him to immense personal risk. Yet he persisted because he recognized that truth was a powerful form of resistance. His speeches in Canada, Britain, and occasionally the northern United States were calculated acts of advocacy, designed to inspire, inform, and mobilize without recklessly endangering those he guided. One of the most remarkable aspects of Josiah Henson's life was his understanding of legacy. He did not measure success in personal accolades, but in the tangible improvement of lives around him. The settlement he helped establish in Upper Canada, the families he guided, and the educational programs he nurtured were his living memorial. He understood that enduring impact required investment in others, in structures, and in knowledge, more than recognition or fame. Even as he aged, his moral compass remained unshaken. He continued to speak out against injustice, counsel the newly free, and document his life. His autobiography was not an act of vanity. It was a deliberate effort to preserve truth against distortion. He anticipated that memory could be manipulated, and that his story might be simplified, misinterpreted, or erased. By recording it meticulously, he created a safeguard for history itself. Josiah Henson's psychological resilience, NCE, and strategic foresight provide modern lessons on leadership, moral courage, and the exercise of agency under extreme constraint. His life illustrates how complex survival strategies, ethical integrity, and community focus can combine to produce profound change, even in the most oppressive circumstances. The people he guided to freedom often carried forward his teachings in ways that transformed entire communities. They became educators, leaders, and advocates themselves. In this way, Josiah multiplied his influence exponentially. Each life touched, each family protected, each community strengthened, became part of a ripple effect that extended far beyond what any single individual could achieve. Even in the face of distortion and erasure, the real Josiah Henson remained a model of strategic, ethical, and moral leadership. His life challenges contemporary audiences to reconsider conventional definitions of heroism, resistance, and agency. It asks us to value the quiet, deliberate acts that sustain freedom, protect communities, and preserve human dignity. Josiah Henson's personal life was marked by profound love and recurring loss, experiences that both grounded him and tested his resolve. His family, particularly his wife and children, were constant sources of both joy and concern. The bonds of family and slavery were precarious, fragile, and constantly under threat. Each moment of tenderness existed alongside the ever-present fear that separation, violence, or death could strike without warning. From the earliest years of his marriage, Josiah faced the agonizing reality that his family could be torn apart by the same system that controlled his own life. His wife shared in his burdens, offering support, courage, and insight, even as she endured the constant anxiety of living under threat. Their relationship was one of partnership in survival, an alliance forged in shared adversity and strengthened by commitment to each other and to the future of their children. The children were at the center of Josiah's moral universe. He recognized that the trauma of slavery could be passed down unless actively countered by education, guidance, and emotional care. He taught them more than literacy or religious lessons. He instilled a sense of agency, resilience, and ethical responsibility. He wanted them to understand that their humanity could not be stolen, even when external circumstances attempted to do so. Every lesson was a defiance, a subtle act of rebellion that preserved dignity and hope. Yet despite his care and strategic planning, loss remained a constant shadow. Family members were sold, threatened, or injured. Friends he had guided to freedom were sometimes recaptured or murdered. Each tragedy left its mark, deepening Josiah's understanding of the fragility of life and the weight of responsibility. These experiences did not embitter him, but refined his strategies. He learned to balance caution with courage, hope with realism, and patience with decisive action. The emotional toll of these experiences was immense. He carried grief silently, recognizing that despair could paralyze action. Instead, he channeled his pain into practical efforts, reinforcing safe routes, building secure communities, and writing guidance for others to follow. In this way, sorrow became a tool for foresight, rather than a burden that immobilized him. His interactions with other formerly enslaved families were deeply shaped by empathy. Josiah knew that freedom was not simply a legal status but a complex journey requiring moral, emotional, and practical support. He became a mentor not only to children but to adults navigating the new challenges of liberty. He offered counsel on property, education, trade, and spiritual life, understanding that the lessons of survival under oppression could be translated into tools for empowerment. In private moments, Josiah reflected on the paradoxes of his existence. He had been enslaved yet free in mind and moral integrity. He had lost family yet created communities. He had been humiliated yet commanded respect in distant lands. These contradictions were not sources of despair but of insight, allowing him to navigate complexity with wisdom and resilience. His writings convey this duality, the coexistence of fear and courage, suffering and strategy, loss and creation. He emphasized that human beings can act ethically even in the most extreme conditions, and that moral leadership often requires quiet persistence rather than public spectacle. The emotional depth of his life provides lessons in endurance, empathy, and strategic thinking that remain relevant today. Josiah's personal losses also deepened his spiritual understanding. He interpreted suffering not as punishment, but as a test of moral and emotional resilience. Faith became a lens through which he assessed actions, choices, and consequences. It allowed him to maintain purpose and clarity, even when the external world was chaotic and cruel. His spirituality was inseparable from his activism. It informed his decisions, strengthened his courage, and provided a framework for guiding others. Even as he aged, Josiah never retreated from responsibility. His focus remained on community building, education, and advocacy. He understood that his legacy would not be secured through fame or recognition, but through the survival, resilience, and empowerment of those he touched. Every life guided, every lesson taught, every settlement strengthened was a continuation of his fight against the lingering structures of oppression. The intimate struggles of Josiah Henson's life, his grief, his care for family, his moral deliberations, and his spiritual grounding, reveal a man whose courage was multidimensional. He was not simply a symbol or a caricature. He was a complex human being navigating extraordinary circumstances with intelligence, empathy, and purpose. Josiah Henson's life unfolded against the backdrop of a nation struggling with its own contradictions. Slavery was entrenched not only in law but in culture, economy, and social expectation. The United States, founded on principles of liberty and justice, simultaneously denied those principles to millions. This duality was a constant presence in Josiah's life. Every decision he made was informed by a keen awareness of the systemic forces arrayed against him and his community. He understood that slavery was maintained not merely through brute force, but through the complicity of institutions, communities, and even religious authority. Laws codified ownership, churches sometimes justified it, neighbors often turned a blind eye. The system was adaptive, reshaping itself as challenges arose. For Josiah, surviving and thriving required a nuanced understanding of these structures. He could not rely on morality alone. He needed strategy, intelligence, and foresight. The rise of abolitionist sentiment in the North and abroad created both opportunity and danger. While allies existed, their influence was limited and often inconsistent. Josiah recognized that freedom could be aided by external advocacy, but it could never be fully secured by outsiders. Liberation had to be claimed through action and organized resistance within enslaved and freed communities. He became a central figure in that effort, building networks, sharing knowledge, and creating safe passages for escape. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 exemplified the constant peril he faced. Even in ostensibly free regions, enslaved individuals could be captured and returned. Josiah's leadership was defined by how he navigated these threats, using careful planning, intelligence gathering, and community coordination. Every journey north was calculated with meticulous attention to risk, illustrating a blend of courage and strategic acumen rarely acknowledged in historical narratives. Josiah's settlement in Upper Canada was more than a refuge. It was an experiment in self-determination. Here, formerly enslaved people could establish schools, farms, and communities governed by principles of justice, education, and cooperation. Josiah's guidance ensured that these settlements were not temporary shelters but sustainable societies. He modeled governance, mediation, and ethical leadership, emphasizing that freedom without structure was precarious. His impact extended beyond the practical. Through speeches, writings, and personal mentorship, he shaped moral and ethical discourse within Black communities. He emphasized that liberation was not simply the absence of chains, but the presence of agency, education, and communal responsibility. His lessons on morality, leadership, and resilience were tools for empowerment, ensuring that the next generation could navigate freedom intelligently. Josiah's experiences also illustrate the intersection of personal courage and collective action. While individual bravery mattered, he recognized that enduring change required networks, alliances, and shared strategies. By facilitating escapes, building communities, and educating others, he multiplied the impact of his actions exponentially. Each life influenced became a node in a broader network of liberation. The broader historical context of Josiah Henson's life reveals the complexity of resistance. It was not merely a matter of physical escape. It involved psychological resilience, strategic negotiation, moral clarity, and social organization. The system of slavery sought to undermine all of these simultaneously. That Josiah succeeded, and that he left behind a tangible legacy, speaks to his extraordinary intellect, foresight, and moral courage. Even as the United States moved toward the Civil War, Josiah's role remained pivotal. His stories, speeches, and writings provided tangible proof of slavery's human cost, influencing public opinion in both the North and abroad. While the war would eventually end legal slavery, Josiah's work ensured that the moral and strategic lessons of resistance were preserved. In considering Josiah Henson's enduring influence, it becomes clear that history often simplifies complexity. Popular narratives emphasize caricature and stereotype while overlooking strategic intelligence, moral leadership, and communal impact. Josiah's life challenges this simplification, demanding that we recognize the sophistication of enslaved and formerly enslaved people's resistance strategies. To understand Josiah Henson fully is to confront the realities of systemic oppression, the moral compromises forced upon individuals, and the extraordinary courage required to navigate such a world. His life demonstrates that freedom is not merely the absence of chains, but the active cultivation of agency, ethics, and community. Josiah Henson's legacy was profoundly shaped by the cultural distortions that followed the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. While Harriet Beecher Stowe drew inspiration from his autobiography, the fictionalization of his life created a tension between reality and perception. The character of Uncle Tom, celebrated in the novel for moral steadfastness, was gradually transformed in popular culture into a symbol of submission. Stage adaptations, minstrel performances, and subsequent media portrayals emphasized passivity and compliance, overshadowing the courage, strategy, and leadership of the real Josiah Henson. This distortion was not merely a literary curiosity. It had tangible social consequences. The caricature reinforced stereotypes that undermined recognition of Black agency. People who resisted oppression in thoughtful, strategic ways were often dismissed or ridiculed. The misrepresentation of Josiah's life demonstrates how cultural narratives can weaponize simplification to preserve social hierarchies. Yet despite this, the truth of his life persisted in communities and historical records. Scholars and historians began to disentangle the real man from the fictional character, revealing a life of remarkable intellect, resilience, and ethical leadership. Letters, contemporaneous accounts, and his own writings highlighted the sophistication of his strategies, guiding escapees, building secure settlements, fostering education, and maintaining moral authority in highly precarious circumstances. Josiah's influence on abolitionist literature extended beyond Stowe. His autobiography provided a template for understanding the lived experience of slavery, showing that first-hand testimony could shape public opinion and moral consciousness. It proved that the voices of the oppressed, when recorded and disseminated, could catalyze societal reflection and eventually change. His work demonstrated the power of narrative as a tool for both advocacy and historical preservation. For modern audiences, Josiah Henson's life offers nuanced lessons in leadership, strategy, and resilience. He embodies the principle that resistance takes many forms, some quiet, some visible, and some deeply strategic. Courage is not always dramatic. Sometimes it manifests in patient persistence, ethical decision-making, and careful cultivation of community. Josiah's leadership was both moral and practical, combining intelligence, empathy, and foresight to create lasting impact. Furthermore, his life underscores the import tants of historical accuracy. The contrast between his lived reality and the cultural caricature emphasizes how societies selectively remember. Recognizing Josiah fully requires acknowledging inconvenient truths, the intelligence and agency of enslaved people, the systemic nature of oppression, and the enduring impact of their resistance. Forgetting or misrepresenting these truths diminishes our understanding of history and hampers the ability to draw meaningful lessons for contemporary struggles. Josiah Henson also demonstrates the interplay between personal ethics and social responsibility. He navigated extreme conditions without compromising his moral principles. He understood that leadership demanded not only strategic thinking but ethical consistency. In guiding others to freedom, building communities, and fostering education, he exemplified the idea that moral courage and practical action are inseparable. The settlements he helped establish in Upper Canada and the networks he maintained illustrate a broader vision of liberation. Freedom was not merely escape from chains, it was self-determination, community, and intergenerational resilience. These settlements became models for sustainable social organization, blending practical skills with moral and educational guidance. They served as living proof that formerly enslaved people could create thriving societies when given opportunity and support. Even as time passed, Josiah's teachings continued to resonate. Formerly enslaved individuals he guided carried his lessons into their own communities, multiplying his influence. The intellectual and moral frameworks he instilled enabled others to navigate freedom strategically, preserving dignity and building resilience. His legacy became both tangible and intangible. Concrete settlements, educated citizens, and enduring moral philosophy. Finally, Josiah's life highlights the enduring importance of narrative control. By writing his autobiography and speaking publicly, he ensured that his perspective could not be fully erased. He understood that stories matter, that truth can shape action, and that memory is both a weapon and a shield. His life demonstrates that claiming one's own narrative is an essential act of resistance, and that history is incomplete without the voices of those who lived it. The long-term impact of Josiah Henson's work is both profound and multifaceted. While his name may have faded from mainstream consciousness for decades, the structures he built and the principles he instilled persisted quietly but powerfully. The settlements in Upper Canada, the educational programs he initiated, and the networks he fostered became enduring centers of resilience. These communities provided safety, opportunity, and a sense of identity to formerly enslaved people and their descendants, ensuring that the lessons of survival and self-determination were transmitted across generations. Josiah's commitment to education was particularly transformative. By prioritizing literacy, moral instruction, and practical knowledge, he created a foundation for sustained empowerment. The children he taught were not only able to read and write, but were imbued with a sense of purpose and agency. They understood that freedom was not simply a legal status but a lived responsibility. This focus on education ensured that the fight against oppression could continue in new forms, equipping future generations with the tools to challenge systemic inequality. In historical scholarship, the rediscovery of Josiah Henson's life has reshaped our understanding of resistance. Scholars now recognize that enslaved people exercised intelligence, strategic planning, and leadership that were often overlooked or deliberately ignored. Josiah's example illustrates that resistance is not always dramatic or violent. It can be sustained, strategic, and deeply moral. His approach demonstrates that enduring change often emerges from careful planning, ethical leadership, and community building, rather than spectacle alone. The recovery of Josiah's memory also underscores the importance of narrative control. Popular culture had long distorted his story, reducing a life of courage and agency to caricature. By writing his autobiography, speaking publicly, and documenting his experiences, he ensured that the truth of his life could survive attempts at erasure. This act of self-authorship highlights the broader lesson that reclaiming one's narrative is a crucial form of resistance. Historical memory is not neutral, it is contested, and those who control the story often shape perception, power, and legacy. Modern parallels to Josiah Henson's life are striking. Systems of oppression may have changed form, but many of the challenges he confronted, inequality, systemic injustice, and the manipulation of narratives, persist. His life teaches that agency, moral courage, and strategic thinking are essential tools for navigating such realities. By studying his life, contemporary audiences can gain insight into effective leadership, community resilience, and ethical decision-making under pressure. Furthermore, Josiah's emphasis on the moral and ethical dimensions of resistance is deeply relevant today. He demonstrated that survival is not merely physical but also spiritual and intellectual. Maintaining integrity, cultivating empathy, and guiding others ethically are as crucial to liberation as legal freedom. His life encourages reflection on how modern societies respond to injustice, how leaders act under duress, and how communities preserve knowledge, culture, and dignity in the face of adversity. The long-term recover. Why of Josiah Henson's story also challenges the way history is taught and remembered. It calls for attention to nuance, complexity, and the lived experiences of individuals whose contributions have been minimized. Recognizing Josiah's life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about complicity, erasure, and the selective nature of memory. His story is a corrective to the simplifications and distortions that have long dominated narratives about slavery, resistance, and heroism. In essence, Josiah Henson's life is a masterclass in resilience, agency, and ethical leadership. He demonstrated that courage can take many forms, that leadership requires both intelligence and empathy, and that freedom is an ongoing practice rather than a fixed state. By building communities, educating others, and preserving his story, he created a legacy that transcended his immediate circumstances. His life reminds us that historical figures are not simply symbols, they are sources of knowledge and ethical guidance. Remembering Josiah Henson, in his full complexity, offers lessons that extend far beyond the historical moment of slavery. It challenges us to confront injustice wherever it appears, to value strategic and ethical forms of resistance, and to preserve memory as a means of empowerment.